How's it going, Elementalists? I'm back with another starter deck video, and today we're going to be talking about Hail of Arrows. Now, Hail of Arrows is an Earth-Water unit-based control deck, essentially. It's great for those who like to turtle up into strong defensive positions, slowly encroaching on their opponent and taking away their options bit by bit through freezing effects and pesky ranged attacks. So if that sounds like the kind of thing that's up your alley, you may want to give this deck a try. So once again, I've split the deck into 4 categories here. We've got the control core, the ranged core, the front lines, and utility spells. And you can see there's just a ton of units in this deck. It really is like a unit-based control deck, pretty much. So without further ado, let's go into some examples of each of these categories of card. So I'm going to start off talking about the front lines. Even though this deck focuses mostly around ranged attacks and control effects, so the freezing core and the range core might be the exciting parts, the front lines are very, very important to your strategy. You want to make sure that you have these established first so that you can actually set things up behind it, and those units aren't just going to get run down and annihilated. These are the things you really need to get established first early on, and everything else kind of bolsters and supports them. This is like the core of your turtling strategy. And no card is more emblematic of that than the Rooted Sentinel. The Rooted Sentinel is probably the most efficient 3-drop in the game for the trade-off of not being able to move and attack. It's highly immobile, but when it gets set up in one position, it defends it incredibly well. It's super duper hardy with 5 health and 2 armor, and it has decent attacks as well. 4 in the front, is going to rival its fire peers, and the 5 side attacks make sure things can't just slip by it without taking a really heavy attack. So this guy is one of the cards that's super important to get established early on in the center of the board to kind of just buy you some space to set up behind. And similar to that, that's kind of like what this entire section is meant to do. Get you some space so that you can set everything up behind it and make sure you have a strong maypole to build around. Next up, in the ranged core, these are the units that all have these ranged attacks. So if you just look at like the crossbow knight, for instance, they actually have a range. They don't have to attack units that are just directly adjacent to them. They can attack something 1 tile beyond that. And you even have cards like Siege Ballista that can't hit anything adjacent to it, but have a range that can hit 2 tiles ahead of it or the entire board away at 3 tiles. These units are the ones you want to set up behind your front lines to basically cut off summoning space from your opponent. They won't want to summon in tiles that are covered by these ranged units, otherwise they're just going to get pelted to death before they can even really do anything. But I think one of the cards to really go over and highlight in this section, besides Reginald, of course, who brings the best out of all of your ranged units, is the Freezing Dartslinger. And the Freezing Dartslinger is really emblematic of this deck because not only is it able to strike at a range, but it can also pin down those foes by freezing them on hit. So if it actually deals hit point damage to a unit with its ranged attacks, it's going to freeze it in place. And freezing is a very nasty effect that actually transitions really nicely to the next section. So the next section is your control core, and like I was talking about at the end of the range core, most of these units center around the effect of freezing. So freezing is basically a temporary effect that gets placed on enemy units, and when a unit is frozen, it cannot attack, move, and none of its abilities function, even the passive ones. Those get totally turned off. So it's a hard disable for a unit that generally is removed when the unit misses a round of combat. So like after its next activation. So if you look at like a card like the Snowman, they are frozen until their next activation phase. That's the general duration of freezing. So pretty much that unit is totally out until they miss 1 combat and then they come back. But units like the Snowman can chain freeze enemies. As long as it's doing hit point damage with its attacks, it's going to continually freeze that frozen foe. So it'll miss a round of combat, and then your turn will come back, the Snowman will hit it again, refreeze it, and so on. So this is one of the ways that this deck locks down the board and really just controls things. Because while you're doing that Chain Frost, they your opponents can't move, none of their abilities work, that unit is basically useless, except that it still grants summoning space. That's pretty much all it's doing, as it's slowly being plinked to death by your ranged units and this snowman. So next up are your utility spells. And while a lot of these spells are parts of specific 2-card combos that I'll cover later in the combo section, one card I wanted to highlight is Gaia Pulse. Now, in this deck, you can always turtle up and slowly encroach on your opponent's position to gain more and more space and get an advantage that way in kind of a more traditional sense. But that's not the only way that this deck can gain an advantage. Thanks to Gaia Pulse, you're actually able to ramp your element base and get more elements than you should have at that stage in the game. So what that allows you to do is turtle up and then build up your element base so you can summon more bigger units faster and then overwhelm your opponent that way with just a significant resource advantage. And Gaia Pulse is great at doing that. It replaces itself because it allows you to draw a card. It adds one element that's already ready to play into your mana pool, and it has that Triversity cost. So if you manage to have 3 different element types, it only costs 2, and then one of those 2 gets replaced with a new element that's ready to go. So it ends up being very cheap after turn 4 and onward, when you can have the 2 earth required and then the 3 different types. So it can be a very, very powerful way to gain an advantage in a less traditional sense, which is why it is important to highlight. So now that we've gone over a few cards in each of the sections of the deck, let's talk about some notable combos. The first combo I want to talk about is Tactical Summoning and Arctic Slime. So Tactical Summoning basically allows you to summon a unit 1 row deeper than you otherwise would, and it sets its base armor to 3. So it's really good for units that want to be in deep and have no armor or negative base armor, because that'll increase their armor the most and make them very hardy. This makes Arctic Slime a great candidate for Tactical Summoning. It wants to be in deep because of its reaction. When it ends its activation on top of another unit, it deals armor-piercing damage to it and freezes it. Also, it deals 1 damage to everything around it, so you don't exactly want it next to your units either. Although in this deck, a lot of your units will be armored and they won't care that much about this 1 damage. But this is also a unit with no armor, so putting it really deep with Tactical Summoning gives it extra reach. It allows it to use its ability away from your units and be very, very pesky, and gives it 3 armor. And the drawback to Tactical Summoning, where your unit can't attack, that doesn't affect Arctic Slime. Arctic Slime doesn't really want to attack. His reaction isn't an attack effect, so it will still go off. But its attack edges, they're all 0. It doesn't really do damage through its attack. It uses its ability to do a little bit of damage, but mostly control the board. So these cards go together very, very well in this deck, and it's definitely a combo worth highlighting. Next up, this is kind of a general thing. This is not exactly like 2 specific cards. You can see there's like a bunch of cards here. But the idea is there's a lot of cards in this deck that either have no movement, like the Siege Ballista or the Stonewall, or have very limited movement, like the Rooted Sentinel we discussed before. And one way you can mitigate this and reposition these units is through effects like Juggle, which allows you to swap 2 units that you control with each other, or the Aqua Juggler, who has an ability to trade places with another unit you control. And there's a lot of things you can do with these types of effects. It really makes your combat phase a lot more flexible to have someone like this at your disposal, but they're just doubly useful for repositioning some of these units that don't move at all. It allows you to move around your Ballista, a threat that maybe your opponent was depending on staying in the same spot, and fair enough, it normally doesn't move. But being able to move it all of a sudden might throw a wrench in their plans. So just knowing that these are options to reposition some of these units is definitely good to know about. And the last combos revolve around, all of your ranged units, but Sniper is a good example because he benefits even further from things like the Shot Caller. So what am I talking about? The Shot Caller here, if he is in front of one of your ranged units, his reaction is when he has a ranged attack fired through him, it greatly increases its power. And the Sniper has a reaction that if he fires an attack through an ally's tile, it can actually shoot 1 range further. So if he has somebody sitting in front of him, it allows him to steady his shots and shoot further, And if Shot Caller is standing in front of your ranged units, it increases the power of the attack. I think you can see why these two work together so well. All of a sudden you have a sniper behind a shot caller, and you have an attack that has extra range and 4 extra damage, which is incredibly threatening. And then the other card here, Cold Snap, it works well with all ranged units, like I was saying before. I'm just using the sniper because he's basically a good ranged token in this case. But yeah, this helps freeze units. Any ranged unit that is not the freezing dart slinger will not automatically freeze other units on contact when they deal damage. But Cold Snap is basically a curse that you can attach to an opposing unit that will allow any of your ranged units to do that. So you stick it on a big threat, it lowers their armor, which allows your attacks to have extra reach. You know, you'll be able to, if your sniper only deals 2 damage and they had 2 armor, well, now it will deal actually 1 damage by lowering their armor by 1, and will get that freeze effect so you can keep them pinned down and eventually take them out. So Cold Snap is a good option dealing with armored units, which this deck kind of struggles with because it's kind of a death by 1,000 cuts sort of situation, and a lot of these freezing effects are mitigated by armor or damage prevention. So Cold Snap is a way to get around that, and it's also a way to just make all of your ranged attacks just that much more pesky and lockdown effects on their own. So moving right along, let's talk a little bit about my recommendations for first picks in this deck when making your starting hand. And again, kind of like the previous deck, the Radiant Pack, there's a lot of different situations and different rationales behind these first picks, so let's just get right into it. So if you're going first and you want to play it safe, I think the safest option is to just pick a scout. Scouts allow you to move forward faster than any other 1-drop because they can move the turn they're summoned. So you can start with a scout, play the scout, move it forward, and you're already in the second row, which allows you on your next turn to just right away place a forward wall or forward defensive unit, anything you have at that point. You could even move the scout 1 deeper and place those things even deeper, though that might be a little bit of an overextension in most cases. It's still something that you can opt to do if the situation provides. If it seems like your opponent isn't doing much or they're playing a slower deck or something like that, you can really be greedy and take a lot of space with the scout. So the scout is kind of just like the 1-drop to go for if you want to play it safe. Now if you're going second and you'll have an extra element, again the scout is probably a unit you might want to pick up if you're playing safe, but now it's kind of for a different reason. On turn 2, when you have your 2 elements, the scout works really well with the stone wall. But the scout is a little rarer in the deck than the stone wall, so it's easier to have the stone wall in your hand and pick the scout rather than picking the stone wall and trying to draw into a scout. The scout is also a little bit more useful on its own without the wall than if you have a wall without a scout. But the reason they work together is the scout and the wall in your starting hand allows you to play the scout, move it forward, and then on your second summoning phase, you can put the wall right next to it. And on your first turn with 2 elements, you already have a forward position wall, which you can then start setting up behind. So this is a very safe pick for going second as well. If you want to play for 3 elements, then Rooted Sentinel, like we discussed before, is kind of the maypole of the deck and definitely a card that you're going to want to have. So I could see starting with this if you're playing for mid-game and you are playing against perhaps a slower deck. You don't mind having nothing to do on your first turn, potentially first 2 if you're going first. Then you can opt for the Rooted Sentinel because this is a very important card to get established in the middle of the board so you can start building around it. And then also, if you want to play for turn 3, you can pick up the Freezing Dart Slinger. This is more of a recommendation if you're going against like fire decks or low armor decks that are going to find this unit incredibly pesky. One Freezing Dart Slinger can do a lot to tie down the advances of a lot of different units. It's very mobile. It does a decent amount of damage, especially to unarmored units, and it can lock them down with its freezing effect. Yeah, this is more like a very specific pick for those low armor matchups. If you're going against a deck with standard or high armor, the Freezing Dart Slinger is not going to be able to hold it down all on his own and might not be the best first pick. And then, if you're being very greedy, you could start with Gaia Pulse. I would only recommend this if you're playing against a deck that you know is very slow and likely won't have much to do the first couple turns. Then you can pick up a Gaia Pulse and hope to get an element advantage as early as possible, playing this on turn 3. or maybe turn 4 after you activate Triversity. So you can basically just get that resource advantage flowing as early as possible. Again, Gaia Pulse doesn't really help out with the board, so picking this up in your early hand with no guaranteed way to support yourself or make sure you don't just get run over can be risky, but sometimes that's just the way people like to play. So if that's you, you might want to consider starting with Gaia Pulse. And last but not least, like all decks, Reginald, he is kind of the face of the deck. He buffs up all of your ranged units. I could see wanting to have him in your hand. And also, unlike a lot of other heroes, he doesn't take a lot of out of color commitment, and he only costs 4. So starting with Reginald is a better idea than starting with a lot of the other heroes. And he just is very, very important for the deck. The only problem is if you go in too hard on just your ranged units and don't set up front lines in front of them, then they can get cleared out by AoE spells, and there will be no survivors because they're pretty frail, or something can just run up on them and kill them. They're just very vulnerable without the people in front of them. So I would generally recommend starting with something like Rooted Sentinel over Reginald, but sometimes you just haven't seen him in a while and you just want to play around him. And then there's also Grimsby. Grimsby in this deck is kind of more for when you're well established in your lockdown strategy and lots of things are frozen on your opponent's side of the board, because his real ability is making sure that all the frozen units don't even grant summoning space to your opponent, so they can't just reinforce their frozen friends. They kind of have to just hold that. They got to just be stuck. And, Grimsby is great for that. But he's not usually going to carry the fight on his own. He's more powerful when combined with a lot of other control effects. So I generally would not recommend starting out with Grimsby. But, again, if you haven't seen him in a while, you just want to play with Grimsby, absolutely go for it. This is not an all-encompassing list of all the possibilities to start with. You can start with whatever you want. Again, these are just sort of the options that I gravitate towards when I play the deck. So now that we've kind of gone over the deck and we're pretty familiar with it, let's take a look at the board and look at some strong positions in this deck. Again, it's a little hard to look at positions in a vacuum because there's no opponent, but this deck makes it a little easier than most because your main goal is to form a strong turtled position like this. And generally they're all going to look like this more or less, with some ranged units in the back and some front lines keeping them safe. I like this position because it's just very flexible. You can basically hit all of these spaces with a variety of different attacks. Like for instance, if you want to freeze that threat, well, your 2 movement freezing dart slinger can get over there and hit it. Or if you just want to do a bunch of damage to this space, you could use the freezing dart slinger for that, or you can move it over and use the sniper to hit either of these spots with a bunch of damage. In fact, the sniper being here basically threatens these 6 tiles with a boatload of damage, at least in these 4, and a little bit of damage in these 2, because if you want to get the shot caller boost, you can always do that and hit this for a ton of damage, or you could do this and hit either of these 2 tiles for a ton of damage. So there's just a lot of ways to move these units into positions where they're going to do just an absolute grip of damage. Another thing you can do with the shot caller is you can actually move him up and over if you want him to be in front of your Rooted Sentinel for whatever reason. He's more frail, so generally you probably wouldn't want to do this, but you still could because of his strafe ability. And, that allows you to threaten this with an absolute boatload of damage. And, you can do all manner of things from this position. Not actually that. Sniper can't actually run all the way over there. But it is incredibly flexible and incredibly threatening. You've got potential freezing, you've got potential high damage, you can push forward with the Rooted Sentinel if it's finally time for that. You can expand the wall, start building a wall all the way across here. You can just do all sorts of stuff with this position, which is why I think it's particularly strong. And another strong position, kind of like the last, just more advanced, when you finally want to encroach and finish off your opponent, you move forward your Rooted Sentinel, you get like a tactical summoning or a deeply summoned Arctic Slime, and you've got Reginald and a Siege Ballista back here, just buffing up all your ranged units, making them incredibly oppressive. They can hit the whole board, they're stronger, this is basically your opponent allowing you to do whatever you want and just walk over them. This is an advanced stage of this deck where if it's gotten to this point, it's probably over. And there's actually so many other threats in the deck that I haven't talked about. There's a couple extra engines and ways to capitalize on them with the Snowball Slime and Sai, the Soulbond Golem. Another combo which I will leave for you guys to look into. And also there's just the Frost Worm lurking in here somewhere, which is one of the marquee just finishers in the entire game. So this deck has no shortage of powerhouse late game and very strong options to just capitalize on all of the time you're given. So, don't think that this is the only strong position for this deck. This is just one of many faces which spell doom for your opponent. Basically, if you're allowed to turtle up and do everything you want with this deck, you should most likely win out in the late game, which, that's kind of the point. If it's a control deck that doesn't win in the late game, then you kind of have problems because you're just controlling your opponent and eventually they have more advantage than you anyway. So it makes sense that this has so many late game threats. And yeah, this is just another strong position. Your ranged units can hit the entire board. You've got Rooted Sentinel moving up into the face of your opponents. We've got Arctic Slime back here just freezing everything. Basically, there's no tile on this board that your opponent wants to occupy. It's all bad. It's all bad for everyone. So, again, very advanced board state. It kind of looks like the other board state, just a few turns later when you're more established. And this is generally what the deck is looking to do. So I think that's going to do it for my overview of Hail of Arrows. Set up an established armored front line, put ranged units behind them to blink away at your opponents, and cast ice spells and use freezing attacks to limit your opponent's options until they have none left but to resign. Thank you so much for watching this video, and if you're the kind of player who's very patient, has more of a taste for control decks, please give this deck a try. I think you might really like it, and I look forward to seeing you on the field of Elementile.